behave. And yes, I have made notes, and I'm not going to apologise. These are good notes. These are the best notes. They're great notes. And academics usually, if they're invited to come and do something funny or talk about or be a stand-up comedian, academics usually do fancy themselves. They can turn their hands to anything. I don't know how you noticed this. And there's a famous study in psychology where a sample of academics were asked, a sample of professors were asked about their jobs. And 94% of them said that they were above average at being a university lecturer. That's quite a significant finding. It relates to a widespread phenomenon in psychology. When I first heard that, 94% thought they were above average in being university lecturers. I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I thought, surely it's higher than that. Only 94%. I mean, that was almost unbelievable. But this is an important finding about the self-serving bias. The idea that everything we do is really good. And there are experiments in psychology that show that if you were given the opportunity to roll a dice and bet fictitious money on that, you will bet more fictitious money on the roll of the dice if you get to roll it yourself than you would if your friend rolled it for you. So this widespread, strong, replicable finding that we have an illusion of control over random events, and we feel we have power, and we feel we have something amazing to offer the world. 94%. And why is this relevant? Why does this work? Well, smokers overestimate the number of smokers in the population. Non-smokers overestimate the number of non-smokers in the population. So these types of self-serving biases affect our choices and our sense of normality and what it is we feel is socially acceptable. Anyway, that wasn't particularly funny, but it is informative, and I did say I would be informative too. So what do we do in academia when we're asked to do something like stand-up comedy? Well, the logical thing, of course, we do is we go to our usual sources. I'm a professor of psychology, so naturally I look at either Wikipedia or Google. Now, when you look at Google and look up stand-up comedy and psychology thereof, you get to see all sorts of interesting theories. And generally speaking, the idea of stand-up comedy, or any comedy at all, there are lots of interesting social scientific theories about this. And it all relates to violating the norm, violating the social norm. If you do something slightly unusual, slightly weird, slightly strange, you're violating the norm, and that can be funny. And the theory goes that you shouldn't do it to extremes, because that can be scary. Criminals violate social norms. They're not considered funny, they're considered scary. So the theory is called the theory of benign violations. And I always think if a psychologist was to do a comedy show, that would be a good name. Benign Violations, Brian Hughes. Okay. Anyway, so what I do in research, as I'm a stress psychophysiologist, I look at different ways in which people manifest stress responses under laboratory conditions, and we always try to look at ways in which we can moderate those responses. And because that's not particularly interesting to most people, I want to talk a little bit about the social factors that determine stress responses. One of them is social support. I did a PhD on social support and blood pressure stress responses. And I find people are very fascinated by the idea of social support, this idea that we can study something that people do, commodify it, deploy it in the interests of the public, and make the world a better place. But in reality, the way in which we treat each other, this notion of social support, is far more convoluted, mostly because deep down, most people don't like other people, and they don't like other people helping them. And when other people come and help you, it gives you negative feedback about your own competence. At the back of your mind, you have a question: does this person think that they're better than me? You also have this build-up of reciprocal debt. This person's done me a favor, I'll have to do them a favor later. You have this sense of esteem threat. This person's more confident than I am, so therefore all of this social support is actually a bad thing. And of course, the most important issue is that people differ in their attitudes to social interaction. And this is quite important for an area that I do a lot of research in, namely blood pressure stress responses and heart attacks. This idea that everybody loves to be supported comes through in medical care in the form of, for example, group therapy during rehabilitation. So if you have a group of people who have had heart attacks, they might be encouraged as part of rehabilitation to attend a group session with other people who have heart attacks. Now the interesting thing about heart attacks is that the risk factors, psychosocial risk factors for having a heart attack include things like interpersonal hostility. So if you score high on a measure of interpersonal hostility, you're in a high risk group for developing heart disease and therefore having a heart attack. So you get a bunch of people together in a room who've had heart attacks. There's a preponderance of people who have hostile personalities, which is related to the type A personality that other people might have discussed before. So you've all these people in the room who don't like each other, and they're expected to benefit from social support. Okay. And there is one final theory in relation to social support that's relevant here. A lot of people think that it's a good idea to have successful people role model life success in a social support context. So you have your group therapy, like marriage counselling. You have a group of people who've got great marriages, and they tell you about their life, and suddenly this makes your marriage, it gives you something to aspire to. Well, there's a thing called social comparison theory that actually shows that it's much more beneficial to involve yourself in a group therapy situation with everybody else who has worse marriages than you. Because you begin to engage in what psychologists call downward social comparisons. And you can feel better about yourself. And this has been demonstrated in all sorts of contexts. Yeah. It is very much the Jerry Springer, Jeremy Kyle thing. We like watching these deviants and degenerates because it makes us feel superior in all sorts of ways. All right, so psychologists are often asked about advice for getting along with people, like romance or sexuality. And it's true, you can look at a lot of research online, Google Scholar, remember, and look up psychology of romance. And I had to look at some recent studies which really offer some groundbreaking findings, I think. One paper I saw said that online dating, works better when you include attractive pictures of yourself with your profile. Okay, groundbreaking. Research right there. When you spend 70% of your time describing yourself and 30% explaining what you were looking for in a relationship. That's actually potentially useful information. And when your username begins with the letters A to M. worth making notes, I think. Yes, okay. Another study, and I think you'll be inspired by this, from the journal Computers and Human Behavior. They wanted to know if you were going to communicate using technology to somebody in order to seduce them, what method of technology would actually work best? And they compared, and they used college students as a sample. Now, a lot of psychology studies use college students to try to study things like political martyrdom or end-of-life fear. Using them to study, romantic behavior and technology is probably not such a bad deployment of that method. Okay, so the authors found that romantic emails elicited significantly greater physiological arousal than romantic voicemails. Okay? Make of that what you will. But they said, which I think is the funniest thing I've ever read in an article of this kind, they said that this debunked a common claim. And the common claim was that lean, asynchronous, computer-mediated communication is incompatible with seductive success. All right, so now I'm glad to be able to rule that particular nugget out. Then there's this other kind of realm of research around evolution and psychobiology and things like hormones that and various biochemicals in the body that are somehow implicated in romance. And one common one is MHC, major histocompatibility molecules that are part of the biochemistry of the body that are involved in detecting self from non-self at a molecular level. And so if you're having a transplant, the success of that transplant will be determined by the efficacy of these particular molecules. But there is, of course, no physiological entity that can't be sort of grandly interpreted as somehow implicated in the evolution of human proclivities. And so it has been argued that these MHC, major histocompatibility complex molecules, are involved in mate selection. In other words, that you can detect in another person whether their MHC molecules are compatible with yours, and therefore whether you will have healthy offspring. And the way in which you do that, there are two ways in which you do this. One is you smell the other person, and you subconsciously detect this. And the other is that you can taste their saliva. And there is a whole psychology around kissing. People argue that the reason you dig your tongue into another person's mouth is not because of some sort of, you've seen it on TV. It's because of an instinct imprinted in your genetic makeup that drives you to do this in order to pick the best mate. So you're doing a kind of biological cross-check on potential partners in order to isolate that partner with whom you will have healthy offspring. There you go. I'm not so sure I agree with, or I believe that theory. I mean, usually people do more than just kiss somebody in order to identify a mate. And if that were the strategy, then all the kissing should happen at a sort of a mass level, rather than at the end of some hyper-elaborate, ritualistic, culturally driven sort of journey of turmoil. Okay, but should we trust psychologists anyway when they're asking us about love and romance? Because statistics show, science, in the United States, the census gathers data on profession, but also on marriage success. And in the United States, the divorce rate among psychologists is 19.3%. So around 1 in 5 psychologists' marriages end in divorce. And just by way of comparison, civil engineers, 9.35%, dentists, 7.75%, optometrists, 4.01%. I've made a note here that they're good at seeing eye to eye with their partner. And they did tell me to be funny. Dancers and choreographers, 43%. Now, this is in the United States, this is a large sample, so it's reasonably convincing. So the advice from the research literature, the empirical evidence, if you're seeking evidence-based romance. A, don't be a dancer. B, have a name beginning with the letters A to M. And C, deploy plenty of lean asynchronous computer-mediated communication. All right. Now, another way in which we study social support and social relationships in psychology is, of course, the study of psychotherapy. Lots of people think psychology is psychotherapy, but it isn't. Psychology is an ology subject. It's the study of something, the psyche, which is the non-corporeal being, so the alternative to physical humanity. And there are lots of interesting studies of psychotherapy. And they have a range of striking findings. Now, anybody who's dabbled or read around psychology might be aware that there are different views of the mind. There's the behaviorist view that says that everything is a behavior, and that cognitions are kind of a side effect of existing, that they don't drive anything, they're just sort of a perceptual output of having a brain. Then there's the cognitive view, which is that cognitions are central to everything. We think everything through first and we behave as a result of that. So there are two entirely competing notions, two entirely competing explanations of how the mind works. But a behavior therapist and a cognitive therapist are just as good. So all the studies show that the major different types of therapies are equally effective. So there's no theoretical orientation that is better than any other. And that's quite a puzzling and striking and indeed frightening finding. We also know in psychotherapy research that the number of years you are practicing as a psychotherapist is not statistically associated with your success rate as a psychotherapist. So somebody with 20 or 30 years experience is no better a therapist than somebody with a year's experience. Interesting. We also know that expertise, if you test people on their knowledge of psychotherapy, that's not correlated with outcome. We also know that if you follow the manual for a therapy, because all therapies have manuals these days, it's part of doing research on therapy, but you can actually measure the extent to which treatment fidelity has been achieved, the closeness with which the therapist follows the manual. That's not statistically associated with outcome either. So you can ignore the manual, it'll be just as good as if you study it closely. And there's a very famous study in the 1970s, you can't do it now, for reasons which will become obvious, where in a university context, in a university counselling service, Some historians, philosophers, and mathematicians were recruited, professors of these disciplines, to pretend to be therapists. And the students who attended the clinical setting were evaluated by psychiatrists at the beginning. Most had high anxiety or anxiety disorders. They attended 25 hours of therapy with these fake therapists. They were compared to another group with similar diagnoses who attended the real therapists. They were followed up at the end of 25 hours therapy, and they were followed up a year later by psychiatrists and given new diagnoses. And it was found that the professors of mathematics, history, and philosophy were just as good at providing psychotherapy as the trained psychotherapists. So essentially, what we know about therapy, the theoretical orientation doesn't matter, years of experience doesn't matter, expertise in subject matter doesn't matter, and indeed being a therapist doesn't matter. So the efficacy of psychotherapy is certainly there. It's much better to be in therapy than not be in therapy, but we don't know what it is. We call it wonderfully non-specific effect. So there's this whole notion that therapy is good, but we don't know why. Okay. Now, I want to talk about stress, because stress isn't funny. Hang on. I'll leave that to one side. I do want to talk a little bit about scientific approaches. So are scientific approaches to something like psychology really important? Now, everybody knows that hearsay is no substitute for evidence. And that's a joke. If you think about it, everybody knows this, that's hearsay. It's no substitute for evidence. Okay, fine. It went over your head, and that's reasonable. I expected that would be the case. And that's nothing, that's on me, not you. The idea, however, that hearsay is no substitute for evidence. So human behavior, society, culture, we're always swimming in a sea of claims and counterclaims, assumptions and prejudices about why certain groups of the population are like one thing, why other groups of the population are like something else. And science is our way of gathering evidence, testing it against statistical assumptions perhaps, and coming up with conclusions about why it is that that we believe one claim over another. And I'm going to come back to this when I'm rounding this out, that logical evidence-based claims are, believe it or not, better than the alternative. And we live in a society where that's not necessarily championed by very many people. Science is it's more than just a language. It's more than just a white coat that you wear in a photograph or words and jargon that you speak. And I've explained this particular point before. Some of you might have heard it. But in psychology, we're often forced to use language that seems a little bit strange because we have to try to be scientific. And one good example of this, in the study of gay men or gay women, we can't really say gay men in our research papers because that's considered maybe a little bit offensive in some level. It's just weird. We have to use an expression commonly used is men who have sex with men. Now, I don't like that expression because it implies that they don't do anything else. And it also creates all these strange constructions. So instead of Norwegian gay men, you have the study of men who have sex with men in Norway. In one paper I read, instead of a gay social worker was recruited to conduct interviews, they said, a man who has sex with men with social work training was recruited to conduct these interviews. It creates these kind of convoluted notions. But it also creates ambiguity. Instead of depressed gay men, you see these papers, men who have sex with men with depression. I know, it's not so much an inclusion criterion as a kind of weird fetish or something. But it creates genuine ambiguity, because when you are maybe considering the causes of depression or the best way of dealing with depression, a person's life relationship is very important. So when you have men who have sex with men with depression, find it hard to cope, or find it easy to cope, it's genuinely ambiguous. Are you talking about a gay man with depression, or a gay man whose partner has depression? Men who have sex with men with depression. It's just not clear. But it's psychology's way of trying to be, scientific at the expense of clarity. That's some people will say that's part of the game. But it's not just psychology that comes up with unusual terms. In other sciences, zoology, entomology, you see these things. There's a beetle in the Agra genus that people knew existed, but they couldn't find it. And they went looking, and they went looking, and they eventually found it, and it was a bit of a discovery in entomology. And they decided they would name it something, because they had to, and they named it aggravation. Hence, in a cathartic way, relieving themselves retrospectively of all the pressure of having found this. There's a wasp called a ha-ha. And the journal article describing the naming of this wasp explained that one entomologist saw the wasp and went, aha, and his friend, the second entomologist, went, ha. And so they decided to call the wasp a ha-ha. And then there's a heron, a bird, called Burger Anus. Now, would you like me to tell you the story of how Burger Anus got its name? I'll take silence as assent, as they say. Well, actually, I don't know. I don't think I actually want to know how Burger Anus got its name, but it does actually exist. So we have these ideas, this discussionist, this whole culture around science that you have to do certain things. And what happens, you have to say certain things, you have to speak a certain way in order to be scientific. And what we've seen tonight is that you don't. Science is about ideas, it's about information and knowledge. And you don't have to have a formula of words in order to express that. You just have to have a logic of ideas in order to convey the information in whatever words you like. Because when you kind of pre-script science, you end up with these cliched articulations and these cliched counter-arguments. And a lot of public debate about science reduces to cliche and reduces to knee-jerk responses. So one good example is that people complain about, if something is rare, we should not regulate it. We should keep away. The government has nothing to do with something that is rare or obscure. But it's a bit like murder. The chances of being murdered are tiny, and yet there's still law against it. Nobody complains that this is over-regulation, that this is the nanny state, kind of intruding in our lives. Another claim is if you legalize or regulate something legally, you'll drive it underground. Well, mention murder again. When they made murder illegal, all they did was drive it underground. Now it's only criminals who commit murder. So you end up with these stereotyped arguments and stereotyped debates that pass for intellectual exchange in the public square. And we see it recently that we have this deterioration of political logic, this collapse of order in the Western world. Some would say we've had it here for a very long time. But it's the failure of empiricism and the failure of logic and evidence-based arguments. So the most important thing is that science is about resolving uncertainties, picking between alternative explanations on the basis of rationality and evidence. It doesn't matter whether you wear a white coat, whether you speak a certain vocabulary, whether you're a man instead of a woman, or all of these types of stereotypes that intrude on the scientific exercise from time to time. And I believe that psychology is just important as any other science for this reason, and indeed that scientific literacy and scientific communication are incredibly important for wider society. It affects the way in which we judge politicians, we judge policies, we use an empirical basis and a logical basis to do that. Then it's not just communicating science to one another, it's communicating logic and rationality to wider society. Thank you very much.